Millionaire takes homeless virgin to his ex's wedding. Her shocking move stuns everyone. Welcome to Alcot Stories, dear sweet viewers. With all my heart, I welcome you to Alcot Stories, a place where love comes alive, where emotions touch the soul, and where every story is crafted with deep care and passion just for you. I pour my heart into creating beautiful, heartfelt, and unforgettable love stories to bring you joy, romance, and even a few tears. Every word, every twist, and every moment is written with you in mind, because your love and support inspire me to keep going. But my dear listeners, when you leave the story in the middle, it truly breaks my heart. I work so hard to bring you the best love stories, hoping to touch your soul, and when you don't stay until the end, it feels like my efforts fade away. I need you. Your support means everything to me. Without you, Alcott Stories is nothing. So please stay with me till the last word, support my channel, and help me continue creating the most beautiful love stories just for you. To all my new viewers, welcome to the family. If you love heart-touching romance stories, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to support the channel. Your love keeps me motivated to bring you more amazing stories. Tell me, sweethearts, which city or country are you watching from? I would love to know where my beautiful listeners are from. Drop a comment below. I'm excited to read them. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of Alcott Stories. Much love, always love. A city wrapped in cold, a heart wrapped in pain. The city of New York never truly sleeps, but on this particularly freezing night, the streets seemed quieter than usual. Snowflakes drifted gently from the sky, covering the roads in a blanket of white. The temperature had plummeted, turning the city into a frozen wonderland, beautiful yet merciless. Inside a sleek black Rolls-Royce, Nicholas Sinclair sat in silence, his fingers loosely gripping the steering wheel. The glow of city lights reflected in his sharp blue eyes, but his mind was elsewhere, stuck in the past. Olivia. Even the thought of her name made his chest tighten. She had once been the love of his life, the woman he had dreamed of marrying. But dreams didn't always turn into reality. She had left him for another man, a man with a bigger empire, a fatter bank account, and a charm that blinded her to what they once had. Nicholas clenched his jaw, his knuckles whitening. It had been over a year, yet the wound still felt fresh. He had everything, wealth, power, status, but at that moment he felt nothing but emptiness. As he turned onto a quieter street, something unusual caught his eye. A small, fragile figure curled up on a park bench. A frozen soul in the dark, Nicholas slowed his car, his brow furrowing as he peered through the frost-covered windshield. There, huddled beneath a tattered coat, was a young woman. Her body trembled violently, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to fight off the biting cold. She was brown-skinned, with long, curly hair cascading over her face, partially shielding her from the world. But what struck Nicholas most was the sheer vulnerability in her posture. What the hell is she doing out here in this weather? His mind screamed at him to drive away. This wasn't his problem, but something in his chest tightened, a feeling he couldn't ignore. She'll freeze to death. Without another thought, he pulled over and stepped out, the icy wind immediately stinging his face. The woman barely reacted to his presence, her eyes dull and lifeless. She was barely holding on. A stranger's kindness. "Hey," Nicholas called out, his voice softer than he expected. "You can't stay out here. It's too cold." The woman flinched slightly but didn't look up. Instead, she pulled her coat tighter around herself, as if shielding herself from not just the cold, but him. Nicholas crouched beside her, his heart sinking at the sight of her chapped lips and frostbitten fingers. "I'm not going to hurt you," he assured her. He hesitated, not knowing how to phrase it. "You look like you could use some help." Still, she didn't speak. Nicholas exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. What was he doing? He wasn't the type to pick up strangers off the street, but there was something about her, something in those sorrowful brown eyes that made it impossible for him to walk away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his leather gloves, slipping them over her frozen fingers. She jerked at the sudden warmth. finally looking up at him. And in that moment, Nicholas felt something strange stir inside him. She was beautiful, not in an obvious, glamorous way, but in a way that made him pause. Her features were delicate, her full lips trembling from the cold. But it was her eyes, deep, sorrowful, and filled with untold pain, that held him captive. "Let me take you somewhere warm," he said gently. "I'll get you something to eat." The woman hesitated. Her fingers gripped the bench as if afraid to move. I I don't know you," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. Nicholas nodded. "That's fair. But staying out here all night? That's not safe. Just one meal, one warm place to rest. No strings attached." She studied him as if trying to determine if he was trustworthy. She had been hurt before. That much was clear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a small nod. Nicholas released the breath he didn't realize he was holding. A ride to an unfamiliar world. The drive back to his penthouse was silent, aside from the occasional sound of the heater blowing warm air. Nicholas stole glances at her as she sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. She barely moved, as if afraid she'd disappear if she let herself relax. "What's your name?" he finally asked. A pause, then, softly, "Zariah." Nicholas repeated it in his mind. It suited her, unique yet delicate. He didn't press her for more. He could see it in her eyes. She wasn't ready to talk. And strangely, he didn't mind. He was patient. When they arrived at his penthouse, Zariah hesitated at the door, her fingers grazing the polished wooden surface. She had never stepped foot in a place like this, a world so far from her own. "It's okay," Nicholas said, sensing her unease. "Come in." Slowly she stepped inside, her gaze darting around the grand living room. Everything was too clean, too luxurious, too foreign. Nicholas walked to the kitchen, grabbing a steaming bowl of soup. "Here, Rechin," he said, setting it in front of her. Zariah's fingers trembled as she picked up the spoon. She took a small sip, then another. Then, as if she hadn't eaten in days, she devoured it. Nicholas watched in silence, something heavy settling in his chest. How long had she been suffering like this? As she finished, he handed her a warm blanket. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." Zariah hesitated but eventually curled up on the plush couch, the warmth slowly chasing away the cold from her bones. Nicholas watched as her breathing evened out, her face finally peaceful. For the first time in a long time, he felt something shift inside him. He didn't know what it was yet, but he had a feeling this night would change everything. A morning of hesitation and warmth. The golden rays of the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Nicholas Sinclair's luxurious penthouse, casting a soft glow over the sleek marble floors. The city below bustled with life, but inside there was an unusual quiet. Nicholas stood by the kitchen counter, pouring himself a cup of black coffee. His mind wandered to the night before, to Zariah, the mysterious young woman who now lay asleep on his couch. He had barely slept. Instead, he had found himself stealing glances at her throughout the night, wondering who she was, what she had been through, and why his heart ached for a stranger he barely knew. As if sensing his thoughts, a soft sound broke his trance. Nicholas turned to see Zariah stirring, her long lashes fluttering open. For a brief moment, she looked peaceful, until she remembered where she was. Her eyes widened in confusion, and she sat up abruptly, gripping the blanket wrapped around her. "Good morning," Nicholas said, keeping his voice gentle. "You're safe." Zariah's gaze flickered around the massive room, the modern elegance of it too foreign, too unreal. The polished floors, the expensive artwork, the breathtaking city view. It all felt like a world she didn't belong to. Her fingers clenched the fabric of her oversized coat, a stark contrast to the luxurious surroundings. "Did you sleep well?" Nicholas asked, taking a cautious step closer. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Better than I have in a long time," she admitted. Her voice was soft, hesitant, as if she wasn't used to casual conversations anymore. Nicholas gestured toward the kitchen. "I made some breakfast. You should eat." Zariah blinked in surprise. She wasn't used to kindness. especially from someone like him. Men of wealth didn't offer warmth. They took what they wanted. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked, her voice laced with doubt. Nicholas studied her for a moment. He could sense her walls, the invisible shields she had built to protect herself from the world. He had seen broken souls before, but Zoraya's eyes held a different kind of pain, a quiet, enduring sorrow. "Because I want to," he said simply. No expectations, no hidden motives. She searched his face for a lie, but found none. Hesitantly, she rose from the couch, still clutching the blanket. The weight of a past. She can't escape. As they sat by the fireplace, Zoraya slowly ate her breakfast. Nicholas noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly, the way she savored each bite, as if she had gone far too long without a proper meal. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but rather filled with unspoken thoughts and unshed tears. Finally, Nicholas leaned back in his chair, his voice calm yet curious. "You don't have to tell me, but I'd like to know, how did you end up out there?" Zoraya stiffened. Her spoon clinked against the bowl as she set it down. "I used to have a home," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "A family, a normal life." Nicholas remained silent, giving her space to continue. "My parents, they were everything to me." Her fingers tightened into a fist. "We weren't rich, but we were happy. They worked hard, gave me a good education. I was in college studying to be a teacher." She paused as if the memory itself was too painful to speak of. "And then, everything changed." Her voice cracked. "One night, my parents were in a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light." Nicholas's stomach twisted. He knew loss. He knew grief. But he couldn't imagine what it was like to lose both parents so suddenly. "I had no one left," she continued, staring into the fire. "No relatives to turn to. My parents had debts I never knew about. Our home was taken away, my tuition unpaid. I tried to fight it, but the world doesn't wait for people like me to get back on their feet." Nicholas clenched his jaw. "It wasn't fair." She let out a bitter laugh. "At first I thought I could survive. I worked part-time jobs, stayed with a friend, until I couldn't anymore. One by one my options ran out, and suddenly I found myself on the streets." Silence stretched between them, heavy and raw. Zoraya turned to Nicholas, her eyes searching his. "Now you know why I'm here, why I was out there. That's my story." Nicholas exhaled slowly. This woman had been through hell, yet she was still standing. "You didn't deserve that," he murmured. Zoraya looked away. Deserving or not, it happened. A future she never expected. Nicholas leaned forward, his eyes filled with something unreadable. "You don't have to go back to that life, Zoraya." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, stay here." Her breath caught. "Stay? I have an extra room. You need a fresh start, and I can help you get back on your feet," Nicholas said, his voice firm but kind. "Find a job. Go back to school if you want. You don't have to do this alone." Zoraya's lips parted in shock. No one had ever offered her something like this before. "You barely know me," she whispered. "Why would you do that?" Nicholas hesitated. "Because I see something in you I can't explain. Because you remind me of what it means to fight for something. Because I don't want to be the kind of man who turns away when he has the power to help." Instead, he simply said, "Because you deserve a second chance." Tears burned in Zoraya's eyes, but she blinked them away. She had learned not to trust easily. I don't know," she admitted. "I don't want to be a burden." Nicholas shook his head. "You're not." For the first time in a long time, Zoraya felt something unfamiliar. Hope. She had spent so long being invisible, being treated as if she didn't matter. But here was this man, this wealthy, powerful stranger, offering her something she had long thought was impossible. A future. She swallowed hard. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll stay." Nicholas nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Neither of them realized it yet, but this decision, this simple agreement, would change both of their lives forever. A reminder of the past. Nicholas Sinclair sat in his grand office, the skyline of New York stretching beyond the glass walls. He was reviewing a business proposal when his assistant Eleanor stepped in, carrying an elegant ivory envelope. "This just arrived for you, sir," she said, placing it on his desk. Nicholas glanced at the envelope, the golden cursive lettering catching his eye. Something about it felt off. A strange feeling curled in his chest, one he hadn't felt in a long time. He picked it up and, with a slow breath, tore it open. His eyes darkened as they scanned the elegant invitation inside. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the wedding of Olivia Kensington and Daniel Whitmore." Nicholas's jaw clenched. Olivia, the woman who had once promised him forever. The woman who had left him for a wealthier man, claiming he wasn't enough. And now she was marrying that same man, the man she had chosen over him. The pain should have dulled by now, but the sharp sting of betrayal still lingered. He had moved on, or so he thought. Yet as he stared at the invitation, memories of Olivia flooded his mind, her laughter, her touch, the lies hidden beneath her smile. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. So she wanted him to watch her get married? To prove she had won? Eleanor cleared her throat. "Would you like me to discard it, sir?" Nicholas shook his head. "No," he muttered, tossing it onto his desk. She hesitated. "Are you going to attend?" Nicholas exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know yet," but deep down he did know. He wasn't going to let Olivia think she had broken him. A bold proposal. That evening, Nicholas found himself back at his penthouse, sipping a glass of whiskey as he sat on the couch, lost in thought. Across from him, Zariah sat curled in the oversized armchair, flipping through a book. She had been living in his home for only a few days, yet it already felt natural having her there. She had transformed before his eyes, no longer the fragile woman he had found on the streets, but someone with quiet strength, someone who refused to be defeated by life. And then an idea struck him, a reckless, ridiculous, impossible idea. He set his glass down. "Zariah." She looked up, startled. "Yes?" Nicholas hesitated for only a moment before saying, "I need you to be my girlfriend." Silence. Zariah blinked. "What?" He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Not for real, just for one night. I need a date for a wedding." Zariah's stomach flipped. You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend?" "Yes." Her eyes searched his face, looking for some sort of joke. But Nicholas Sinclair didn't joke about things like this. "Why?" she asked suspiciously. Nicholas exhaled. "Because it's my ex's wedding, and I refuse to show up alone like some heartbroken fool while she parades around in a designer gown, acting like she won." Zariah studied him for a long moment. "So, this is about proving a point?" "Partially," he admitted, "but also because I have no other options." Zariah laughed dryly. "No other options? You're a millionaire, Nicholas. You could take any woman you wanted." Nicholas tilted his head, his gaze locked onto hers. "Exactly, but I don't want just anyone." His words sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Still, she hesitated. "I don't think I'd make a very convincing girlfriend." Nicholas smirked. "You'd be surprised." She shifted in her seat. "I don't know. It feels wrong." Nicholas softened his voice. "Zariah, it's just one night. Nothing complicated, no strings. We go in, make an appearance, and leave. That's it." She bit her lip, thinking. This was insane. She was a homeless woman who had barely started piecing her life back together, and now this millionaire wanted her to dress up and attend a wedding full of high society elites. It was a terrible idea. And yet, when she looked into Nicholas's eyes, she saw something else beneath his cool exterior. A man who had been hurt, who didn't want to face the past alone. Against all logic, she found herself saying, "Okay." Nicholas's lips curled into a slow, satisfied smile. Doubts and what-ifs. That night, Zariah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. What had she just agreed to? She barely fit into Nicholas's world as it was. What if she embarrassed him? What if Olivia saw right through their act? Would it be worth it? Her heart hammered in her chest, But somewhere deep inside, she couldn't ignore the small voice that whispered, "What if this changes everything?" The deal is sealed. The next morning, Nicholas walked into the living room, where Zariah was sipping tea by the window. "Since you agreed," he said casually, "we need to make sure you look the part." Zariah raised an eyebrow. "The part?" Nicholas smirked. "You're going to be the date of a millionaire. That means designer dresses, luxury heels, and the perfect look." Her stomach dropped. "I don't belong in those things, Nicholas." He stepped closer, his voice low and reassuring. "You do, and I'll make sure you see it for yourself." Zariah swallowed hard. She wasn't sure if she was more afraid of the wedding or the way Nicholas Sinclair was starting to make her feel. Doubts and second thoughts, Zariah sat on the edge of her bed, gripping the silk sheets beneath her fingers. She still couldn't believe she had agreed to this madness. Attending a lavish wedding filled with New York's wealthiest, pretending to be the girlfriend of a millionaire. It sounded like a plot from a romance novel, not her life. And yet here she was, about to be transformed into someone she wasn't. A knock on her door startled her. "Come in," she called softly. The door swung open and Nicholas walked in, hands in his pockets, exuding effortless confidence. "The stylist is here," he announced, his deep voice smooth yet unreadable. Zariah swallowed. "Are you sure about this?" Nicholas raised a brow. "Having second thoughts?" She hesitated before nodding. "I just don't fit into your world, Nicholas." A flicker of something passed through his gaze, something unreadable. "You will," he said simply. "Trust me." Zariah's breath caught at those two words. Trust him. Something about them made her chest tighten, but before she could dwell on it, Nicholas stepped aside and a team of stylists and designers entered the room. "Time for the magic to happen," Nicholas said with a smirk before leaving her in their hands. A transformation unlike any other. The next few hours felt like a blur. Stylists fluttered around her like artists working on a masterpiece. Her long, wavy brown hair was washed, conditioned, and styled into cascading curls that framed her delicate face. Her skin, naturally glowing, was enhanced with subtle makeup, bringing out her deep brown eyes and full lips. As the makeup artist worked, the lead stylist, Lena, carefully laid out a collection of gowns for Zariah to choose from. "Mr. Sinclair said to make sure you look like a queen," Lena remarked, giving her an approving smile. Zariah flushed. She glanced at the gowns, each one exquisite, elegant, and dripping with wealth. After some coaxing, she finally settled on a deep emerald green silk gown that hugged her curves in a way that made her feel both sophisticated and powerful. It had a delicate off-the-shoulder neckline, the fabric pooling around her feet like liquid jade. When the final touch, a pair of diamond drop earrings, was added, Zariah barely recognized herself in the mirror. A moment of reflection. Zariah stood up slowly, her breath catching as she gazed at her own reflection. Was this really her? The girl who had once slept on park benches, shivering in the cold? The woman who had lost everything? Now she looked like someone who belonged in Nicholas Sinclair's world. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Are you ready?" Nicholas's voice came from the other side of the door. Zariah took a shaky breath. "Yes." The door opened, and Nicholas froze. Breathless silence. For the first time in his life, Nicholas Sinclair was at a loss for words. Zariah stood before him, transformed into a vision of elegance, her brown skin glowing under the soft lights. The emerald gown fit her like it had been made just for her, the deep color enhancing the warmth in her eyes. His throat went dry. He had expected her to look beautiful, but this was something else. Zariah shifted under his intense gaze, her fingers nervously gripping the fabric of her gown. "Do I look okay?" she asked hesitantly. Nicholas's jaw clenched, his voice coming out lower than he intended. "You look stunning." Zariah's breath hitched at the rawness in his tone. For a moment, everything around them faded. The stylists, the penthouse, the upcoming wedding. There was just them. A strange tension filled the air, something unspoken yet powerful. Zariah quickly looked away, her heart hammering. "We should get going," she murmured. Nicholas cleared his throat, forcing himself to step back. Yes, let's go. The drive to the wedding. The black limousine glided through the city, but inside the car, silence hung between them. Nicholas, usually composed, found himself stealing glances at Zariah. There was something about her tonight, something that made it impossible to look away. She was still the same woman who had sat by his fireplace, telling him about her past. But tonight, she looked like someone who could break hearts, and that realization unsettled him. Zariah, on the other hand, kept fidgeting with her fingers. She could feel Nicholas watching her, could feel the tension that hadn't been there before. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked softly. Nicholas exhaled, finally tearing his gaze away. "It's too late to back out now." She bit her lip, nodding, and then before she could say anything else, the car pulled up to the grand wedding venue. Nicholas turned to her, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "Zariah," he said, his voice low and commanding. She swallowed. "Yes?" He leaned in slightly, his gaze intense. "For tonight, you're mine." Her breath caught. Mine. She had agreed to this arrangement. She knew it wasn't real, but as Nicholas stepped out and reached for her hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight might change everything. A grand arrival. The moment the limousine stopped in front of the grand ballroom, Zariah's hands clenched into fists on her lap. Through the tinted windows, she could see the dazzling chandeliers inside, the flashes of expensive jewelry, and the perfectly dressed guests stepping out of luxury cars. She didn't belong here. She knew it. And yet Nicholas sat beside her, calm and composed, his expression unreadable. "Breathe," he murmured. Zariah exhaled shakily. "This is insane." Nicholas smirked, adjusting the gold cufflinks on his crisp black tuxedo. "Maybe, but if we're doing this, we're doing it right." His confidence was unnerving, and yet there was something steadying about it. A second later, the driver opened the door. The moment that stunned everyone. Nicholas stepped out first, the flashing cameras immediately capturing his commanding presence. Then he turned and offered his hand to Zariah. Her pulse pounded as she placed her fingers in his, feeling the warmth of his touch. As she stepped out, the gasps were instantaneous. The guests, dressed in their finest designer clothes, stared in shock. Zariah could feel the weight of their gazes. Some were curious, some were judgmental. And then there were those, especially the women, who looked at her as if she was an intruder in their world. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. But before doubt could creep in, Nicholas tightened his grip on her hand. A silent message. "You're with me." She straightened her spine, and together they stepped into the ballroom. Olivia's smirk of amusement. Across the room, Olivia turned the moment she heard the gas. She had been the queen of this circle for years, and tonight was no different. Dressed in a glittering white gown, she radiated confidence, her blonde hair styled in perfect waves. When her gaze landed on Nicholas, a familiar smirk curled on her lips. Of course he would bring a woman. It was predictable. And when she saw Zariah, she nearly laughed. A nobody. Just another pretty distraction Nicholas would discard once the night was over. Olivia's gaze swept over Zariah's emerald gown, the way Nicholas's hand rested protectively on her back. How amusing. She leaned in close to her new husband, whispering, "This will be fun." Whispers and disbelief. As Nicholas and Zariah walked further inside, the whispers grew louder. "Who is she? Is she a model? She doesn't look like the type Nicholas usually dates." Zariah heard every word. Her fingers clenched into a fist at her side. But before she could react, Nicholas did something unexpected. He wrapped an arm around her waist. The gesture was possessive, protective, undeniable. And just like that, the whispers changed. "Wait, are they serious? They look real. I thought Nicholas would show up alone." Zariah could hardly process it all. But one thing was clear. Nicholas wasn't just playing along. He was making a statement, a chemistry that couldn't be ignored. The ballroom was breathtaking. Golden chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and a live orchestra playing soft classical music. But none of it mattered. Not when Zariah could feel Nicholas's presence beside her. He wasn't just standing close. He was watching her. Every time she shifted, his gaze followed. Every time she hesitated, he guided her with the lightest touch. It was intoxicating. And the worst part, it didn't feel fake. A dance that changed everything. As the evening progressed, the moment came that no one expected. Nicholas turned to Zariah, his blue eyes darker than usual. "Dance with me." Zariah's heart jumped. "What?" "The first dance is starting." His lips quirked. "I need my girlfriend to play her part." Her breath caught. Before she could object, he led her onto the dance floor. And when he pulled her close, the world disappeared. More than just pretending, Nicholas moved with effortless grace, his hand firm against the small of her back. Zariah followed his lead, her body attuned to his in a way that felt unnatural yet perfect. Her hands rested lightly on his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath the expensive fabric. It was supposed to be pretend, just for show, but the way Nicholas's fingers brushed against her spine, the way his breath tickled her ear as he whispered, "Relax, Zariah," it felt too real. The moment that shattered Olivia's confidence. From the sidelines, Olivia's smirk vanished. She had expected forced politeness, maybe even awkwardness, but what she saw was chemistry, undeniable, undisguised, raw. Nicholas's hand tightened on Zariah's waist, his thumb grazing her bare skin. Olivia clenched her champagne glass so hard it nearly shattered. Her husband noticed. "Something wrong?" he asked. She forced a tight smile. "Not at all." But deep down, Olivia knew she had made a mistake. She had left Nicholas, assuming he would never move on. But now, watching him look at Zariah like she was the only woman in the room, something in Olivia burned. And for the first time that night, she felt threatened. A dance that wasn't meant to be real. The soft notes of the orchestra echoed through the grand ballroom, weaving through the air like an invisible spell. Nicholas's hand was warm against Zariah's back, his touch light yet firm, protective yet possessive. She had never danced like this before, not with a man like him, not in a room full of people who watched their every move with curiosity, suspicion, and envy. Her breath hitched as Nicholas's fingers pressed slightly deeper into the fabric of her gown, guiding her effortlessly across the dance floor. "Relax," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Relax? How could she? His breath was warm against her temple, sending an unexplainable shiver down her spine. This wasn't supposed to mean anything, and yet her heart raced as if it did. The eyes that couldn't look away across the ballroom, Olivia's fingers clenched around her champagne glass. She had planned this night perfectly. She had wanted to see Nicholas alone, bitter and filled with regret. Instead, she saw something that wasn't part of the plan. She saw him smiling. Not the forced, business-like smirk he gave at high-profile events. Not the sarcastic, emotionless grin she had grown used to. This was different. This was real. His eyes followed Zariah's every move, darkening every time she stumbled and lighting up every time she laughed. Something about it twisted inside Olivia like a knife. She turned to her husband, pretending to be uninterested, but deep down she was boiling with jealousy. More than just pretending, Zariah tried to focus on anything but Nicholas. The music, the chandeliers, the murmurs of the crowd. But all she could feel was his presence, the way his fingertips traced the curve of her back, the way his lips were just inches from her ear. "Nicholas," she whispered, trying to ignore the way her body reacted to him. His grip tightened slightly. "Yes?" Her heart pounded. This wasn't just acting. This wasn't just a game anymore. And when she finally dared to meet his gaze, she saw it, the flicker of something dangerous, something real, something that made her forget that she was supposed to be playing a role. She swallowed hard. "Nothing." Nicholas smirked, his lips so close to her cheek that she swore she felt them brush against her skin. "Careful, Zariah," he murmured, her brows furrowed. "Careful of what?" "Careful of making me believe this isn't just an act." Her breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. They just stood there, their bodies pressed together, their hearts beating in an unsteady rhythm. And for the first time, Zariah realized something terrifying. She wasn't acting anymore. The woman who couldn't stand to watch anymore. Olivia's nails dug into her palm. Her new husband was speaking, but she wasn't listening. How could she? Not when Nicholas was looking at another woman the way he used to look at her. Number even worse, he never looked at her like that. She slammed her glass onto the table, startling the people nearby. This was not how the night was supposed to go. This was not how Nicholas was supposed to act. And if he thought she would just stand by and watch, he was wrong. The dance that shouldn't have felt so right. Zariah could feel Nicholas's heartbeat against her palm. Steady, strong, too real. She should have stepped away. She should have reminded herself that this was temporary. But then his fingers trailed up her arm in the lightest touch, sending an electric shiver through her skin. And when she met his eyes again, she saw it. The hesitation, the same confusion she was feeling. The moment stretched longer than it should have. And then the music stopped. The spell broke. But as Nicholas slowly pulled away, his hand lingered on her waist, his touch refusing to let go just yet. His voice was lower this time. "We should sit." Zariah could only nod, because the truth was, she wasn't sure she trusted her legs to move, because something had just shifted between them, and it was something neither of them could ignore anymore. A night of pretending? Or was it? The soft melody of violins filled the grand ballroom, weaving a delicate spell over the guests. The glow of the chandeliers cast a golden shimmer on the polished floors, reflecting the dazzling gowns and tailored suits of the city's elite. But for Nicholas Sinclair, none of it mattered. Not the extravagant decorations, not the fine champagne, not even the whispers of admiration as he walked in with Zariah on his arm. All that mattered now was the woman in front of him. As he guided Zariah onto the dance floor, a strange feeling settled in his chest, one he hadn't expected. This was just supposed to be a game, a well-crafted illusion to prove to Olivia and the rest of the world that he had moved on. But as his hand found the small of Zariah's back, and her fingers trembled slightly in his, the lines between pretense and reality began to blur. A touch that meant more. Zariah had never felt so out of place, yet so seen at the same time. The moment Nicholas pulled her close, a shiver ran through her. But it wasn't from the cold. It was from him. His scent, rich with notes of expensive cologne and something undeniably masculine, wrapped around her, making it impossible to focus on anything else. She told herself this was nothing more than a dance, a fleeting moment in a world she didn't belong to. And yet, as his thumb lightly brushed against the exposed skin of her back, a slow heat crept up her spine. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "Relax," Nicholas murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Zariah lifted her eyes to his, her heart hammering in her chest. "I'm trying." A small smirk played on his lips. "Try harder." She wasn't sure whether it was the teasing glint in his eyes or the way his grip tightened slightly, but suddenly she felt something stir inside her. Something unfamiliar. Something dangerous. A jealous gaze from across the room. Across the ballroom, Olivia's fingers tightened around her champagne glass. She had invited Nicholas tonight for one reason: to see him suffer, to see him alone and regretful as he watched her parade around with her wealthy new husband. But instead, she saw something else, something that sent a slow, burning anger coursing through her veins. Nicholas wasn't miserable. He wasn't broken. He was smiling. And worse, he was looking at Zariah with an intensity Olivia had never seen before. She turned to her husband, forcing a hollow laugh. "She's just a distraction," she muttered under her breath. "Nicholas always picks up strays." But even as she said it, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach, because the way Nicholas was holding Zariah, the way his thumb traced small, lazy circles on her waist, the way his eyes darkened every time she gasped at his touch. This was not an act. This was something else, and Olivia hated it. Dancing on the edge of something dangerous. Zariah's breath caught as Nicholas twirled her effortlessly, his grip never faltering, their bodies pressed together, their movements perfectly in sync. She had never been to a place like this before, never worn a gown that shimmered under the lights. never danced with a man who held her like she meant something. For a moment, she forgot about everything. The whispers, the curious stares, the fact that they were pretending. For a moment, it felt real. Nicholas's fingers brushed against her bare shoulder, sending a jolt through her veins. Her heart pounded in response. Did he know what he was doing to her? Did he feel this too? Nicholas, she whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. His grip tightened, his lips dangerously close to her ear. Yes? She swallowed hard. Nothing. His smirk deepened, and something flickered in his gaze, something dark and unreadable. Careful, Zariah, he murmured, his voice like silk. Her brows furrowed. Careful of what? Nicholas's thumb brushed over her hip in an achingly slow movement. Careful of making me believe this isn't just an act. Her breath hitched. For a long moment, they simply stood there, swaying to the music, their bodies molded together. The world around them faded. The people, the whispers, all of it melted into the background. And that's when she realized it. She wasn't acting anymore. A storm brewing in Olivia's eyes. Olivia's nails dug into her palm as she watched Nicholas lean closer, his lips almost touching Zariah's ear. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. Nicholas was supposed to see her, regret losing her, beg for a second chance. Instead, he looked utterly unbothered. No, he looked enchanted. A sharp wave of jealousy coursed through her, burning hotter than she thought possible. She would not stand for this. Not tonight. Not ever. She turned to her husband, her voice laced with fake sweetness. Dance with me. But even as they stepped onto the dance floor, Olivia's gaze remained locked on Nicholas. This wasn't over. A dance that ended too soon. Zariah barely noticed when the music slowed, signaling the end of the dance. Her mind was spinning. Her pulse was racing. And Nicholas. Nicholas was still looking at her like she was the only woman in the room. For the first time since they had arrived, Zariah felt nervous, because something between them had shifted, and she had no idea what to do about it. Nicholas's fingers lingered on her waist a moment too long before he finally stepped back. We should sit, he said, his voice quieter than before. Zariah could only nod because the truth was, she wasn't sure she trusted her legs to move, because this, whatever was happening between them, was something neither of them could ignore anymore, and it terrified her. A moment of bliss. Shattered Zariah had never felt more out of place yet, more seen than she did tonight. The lingering warmth of Nicholas's touch still tingled against her skin, her heart still unsteady from their dance. She had told herself it was all an act, but the way he had looked at her, the way his fingers had traced gentle patterns on her waist, had made her question everything. For a brief moment, she had allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Wanted, desired, important. But the moment of magic was short-lived, because the second she stepped away from the dance floor, a sharp, cutting voice stopped her in her tracks. Well, well, look at you. Zariah turned, her stomach sinking the instant she met Olivia's cold, assessing gaze. Nicholas's ex-fiancée stood in front of her, the picture of elegance in a designer gown that hugged her figure perfectly. But there was something dark behind her smirk, something sharp and cruel. Zariah swallowed hard, instinctively taking a small step back. Olivia noticed, and her smirk widened. You must be so proud of yourself, she drawled, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. From the streets to a penthouse, from rags to riches. Quite the fairy tale, isn't it? Zariah's throat tightened. She knew this moment would come. It always did. People like Olivia didn't see women like her as equals. They saw them as charity cases, as people to pity or to mock. And judging by the venom in Olivia's eyes, she was here to do the latter. A dagger disguised as a smile. Zariah squared her shoulders, refusing to let Olivia see the way her words stung. I don't know what you're talking about. Olivia let out a small laugh. Oh, come on, sweetheart. Let's not pretend. We both know what this is. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. You think Nicholas actually cares about you? Zariah's breath caught, but she kept her face unreadable. Olivia took her silence as an invitation to continue. You're nothing but his latest distraction. Her eyes flicked over Zoraya's gown, her lips curling in disdain. Dressed up in borrowed clothes, playing pretend in a world that isn't yours. Zoraya felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to fight back, to say something, anything. But Olivia's words hit a part of her she had tried so hard to ignore. The doubt, the fear that maybe, just maybe, Olivia was right. A wound reopened. Olivia saw the flicker of hesitation in Zoraya's eyes, and she went in for the kill. You really think Nicholas sees you as anything more than a game? She murmured, tilting her head. He's using you to make me jealous, and once he's done playing with his little project, he'll move on, just like he always does. Zoraya clenched her fists. She wanted to believe Olivia was lying. She wanted to believe that Nicholas was different. But was he? She had spent so much of her life being discarded, overlooked, pushed aside, first by fate, when she lost her parents, then by the world, when she was left homeless, struggling to survive. And now, Nicholas? Was she really just a temporary distraction to him? Olivia's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she saw the doubt settle in. That's what I thought, she said with a smirk. You don't belong here, sweetheart. You never will. And with that final blow, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Zoraya standing there, feeling as if she had just been shattered from the inside out. A broken escape. Zoraya felt the burn behind her eyes before she even realized she was crying. She turned quickly, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she weaved through the crowd, desperate to escape. She needed air. She needed to be alone. The lavish ballroom blurred around her as she rushed toward the terrace, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The moment she stepped outside into the cold night air, she let out a shaky breath, wrapping her arms around herself. Maybe Olivia was right. Maybe this world wasn't hers. Maybe she should just walk away now, before Nicholas discarded her first. The thought sent a sharp pain through her chest. She had spent years surviving alone. She had built walls around her heart, never letting anyone in. And yet in just a few days, Nicholas had found a way past her defenses. He had made her feel safe. He had made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she could belong somewhere again. But had it all been a lie? A heart that can't let go. Zoraya. The deep voice sent a jolt through her. She turned sharply only to find Nicholas standing there, his brows furrowed in concern. His tuxedo jacket was slightly undone, his tie loosened, like he had been searching for her in a hurry. And then he saw the tears in her eyes. His entire expression darkened. What happened? His voice was lower now, more dangerous. He took a step closer. Who said something to you? Zoraya shook her head quickly. It's nothing. I just... She exhaled, forcing herself to look away. I shouldn't be here, Nicholas. I don't belong in this world. Nicholas stilled. What? She wrapped her arms around herself. This was a mistake. I was stupid to think I could just fit into your world, that I could pretend to be something I'm not. Nicholas took another step closer, his jaw clenched. Did Olivia say something to you? Zoraya didn't answer, but the flicker of pain in her eyes told him everything. A muscle in his jaw twitched, his hands curling into fists. He knew Olivia was cruel, but this was a new low. He inhaled sharply, forcing himself to steady his anger. Because right now Zoraya didn't need rage. She needed him, and he needed her. A realization that changes everything. Nicholas slowly reached out, his fingers brushing against Zoraya's chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. I don't care about Olivia, he murmured, his voice raw. I don't care about proving anything to anyone. Zoraya swallowed hard. Then why did you bring me here? Nicholas exhaled, his gaze searching hers. He had thought he knew the answer, but standing here, watching the pain in her eyes, he realized the truth. At first he had wanted to prove something, to Olivia, to himself. But now the only thing he wanted was Zoraya. You think you don't belong in my world, he whispered? Then let me make a new one, just for us. Zoraya's breath caught, because for the first time she saw it in his eyes. This wasn't about Olivia anymore. This wasn't an act. Nicholas wanted her, and that terrified her more than anything, because now she had everything to lose. A silent ride, a turbulent heart. The drive back to Nicholas's penthouse was cloaked in silence. Zariah sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly at the city lights flickering through the window. She could still hear Olivia's cruel words echoing in her mind. She could still feel the sting of them against her heart. Nicholas's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white. Every few minutes, he stole glances at her, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. He had never felt this kind of anger before, not even when Olivia had betrayed him, because this wasn't about him. This was about Zariah, and the pain in her eyes was unbearable. The walk through the darkness. The moment they stepped inside the penthouse, Nicholas loosened his tie and exhaled sharply. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Zariah turned to him, startled. "What?" His blue eyes, usually so controlled, were filled with regret. "I never should have brought you there. I thought, I don't know. I thought it would be harmless, that it was just for show, but I didn't think about how it might hurt you." Zariah bit her lip, her emotions swirling. "It's not your fault, Nicholas. I knew what I was getting into." Nicholas let out a humorless laugh. "Did you?" His gaze darkened. "Did you know Olivia would tear you down just to get under my skin? Did you know people would look at you like you didn't belong?" He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Because I didn't think, I didn't see it until tonight, and now I can't stop thinking about it." Zariah's chest tightened. She had never seen him like this before. Nicholas Sinclair, the self-made millionaire, the man who never let emotions show, was unraveling. For her. She took a deep breath, forcing a small smile. "I'm tougher than I look." Nicholas shook his head, stepping closer. "You shouldn't have to be." His voice was soft, but there was something deeper beneath it, something that made Zariah's heartbeat quicken. She swallowed hard and looked away, because if she kept staring at him like this, she knew she would fall completely, and that terrified her. A confession in the firelight. They sat by the fireplace, the glow casting soft shadows on the walls. Zariah wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, her fingers gripping the edges tightly. Nicholas sat across from her, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then finally, Zariah whispered, "I was happy once." Nicholas's gaze sharpened. "Tell me." She exhaled shakily, staring at the flames. "I had a home, a family, a future. I was in college, studying to be a teacher." A sad smile ghosted her lips. "I had dreams." Nicholas leaned forward slightly. "What happened?" Zariah's throat tightened. "An accident. A car crash. I lost my parents that night." Nicholas's breath caught. She continued, her voice softer now. "I tried to hold everything together. I worked 2 jobs. I took care of the bills. But one by one, things started slipping. The rent, the tuition, the electricity, and then I lost everything." A heavy silence stretched between them. Nicholas had heard stories like this before. People losing their way, falling through the cracks. But hearing it from her, seeing the quiet pain in her eyes, it felt different. It felt personal. He exhaled slowly. "You never told me." Zariah let out a small laugh. "I don't go around announcing my tragedies, Nicholas." Nicholas clenched his jaw. "You shouldn't have had to go through that. Alone." Zariah shrugged. "I survived." Nicholas looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw past the strong front. He saw the girl who had once had dreams, the girl who had once believed in a future, and in that moment, he realized something. He wanted to give that future back to her. A heart that betrays itself. Zariah tried to keep her walls up. She tried to remind herself that Nicholas was not her world, that men like him didn't end up with women like her. But tonight, she couldn't fight it, because sitting here, listening to his voice, feeling his presence so close, she realized something terrifying. She had fallen for him, completely, irrevocably. She had let her heart betray her, and now she didn't know how to stop it. The moment that changed everything. Nicholas shifted, his eyes never leaving hers. Zariah. She swallowed hard. Yeah? He hesitated, just for a moment, before whispering, Stay! Her breath hitched. What? His jaw tightened. Stay here. Not just for tonight, for as long as you want. Zariah's chest ached. Nicholas. I mean it. His voice was firm. This isn't about Olivia, or the wedding, or proving anything. He exhaled. I just don't want you to go. Zariah's fingers curled into the blanket. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe him. But deep down she was terrified. Because what if Olivia was right? What if Nicholas was just playing with her heart? What if she was just another passing moment in his life? And worst of all, what if she said yes? And in the end, she was left with nothing but a broken heart. She had lost everything once. She didn't think she could survive losing him too. A heart at war. Zariah sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the moonlight spilling through the window. Nicholas's words from the night before echoed in her mind. Stay, not just for tonight, for as long as you want. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the thin blanket around her shoulders. Why did those words scare her more than anything? For the first time in years, someone had offered her a home, a place to belong, a chance to be something more than just a lost soul drifting through life. But deep down, she couldn't shake the fear that it was too good to be true. What if she was just a pity project? What if Nicholas woke up one day and realized she didn't belong in his world? She had already lost everything once. She couldn't survive losing him too. A lump formed in her throat as she turned her gaze to him. Nicholas lay on the other side of the bed, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. His face, usually so guarded and unreadable, looked peaceful in sleep, vulnerable. She hated that her heart ached just looking at him, because she already knew she had fallen too deep, and that meant she had to leave before it was too late. A silent escape. Zariah took a shaky breath as she slid out of bed. She moved quietly, careful not to make a sound as she gathered her few belongings. The oversized coat Nicholas had given her. The small stack of books he had placed on the nightstand, saying she should have something to read before bed. Little things, but they meant everything. Her hands trembled as she wrote a note on the notepad by the bedside table. Thank you for everything. Please don't look for me. She hesitated for a long moment. Then, with a final glance at Nicholas, she slipped out of the room, out of the penthouse, and out of his life. A cold, empty morning. Nicholas woke to an eerie silence. For a moment, he thought it was just another morning. The city outside was still dark, but the faint glow of dawn crept along the skyline. He reached for the warmth beside him, but found nothing. His heart lurched. He sat up abruptly, his pulse quickening. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room, his mind racing. Her coat was gone. Her books, gone. And then he saw it, a single piece of paper on the nightstand. He grabbed it, his hands tightening around the fragile note as he read the words over and over. Thank you for everything. Please don't look for me. Nicholas felt something inside him crack. For the first time in years, he felt hollow. He clenched his jaw, gripping the note so tightly that the edges crumpled. Please don't look for me, as if that was even an option. The feeling of losing her Nicholas stormed through the penthouse, checking every room. Nothing. She was really gone. His hands curled into fists as frustration, confusion, and something dangerously close to desperation clawed at his chest. Why did this feel so different? When Olivia left him, it had hurt, but it was a betrayal. This question mark. This felt like he had lost something he could never get back. His mind raced with memories. Zariah laughing softly as she read by the fireplace. Zariah looking up at him with wide, surprised eyes when he called her beautiful. Zariah pressing her lips together in thought, always hesitating, always afraid to let him in. And then it hit him. He didn't just want to help her. He didn't just want to offer her shelter or security. He needed her. Her presence, her laughter, her stubbornness, her kindness, everything. Nicholas had spent years believing he was immune to love, that nothing could touch him after Olivia. But Zariah, she had torn down his walls without even trying, and now she was gone. A desperate search, Nicholas yanked his phone off the nightstand, dialing his driver. "Did you see Zariah leave?" His voice was sharp, urgent. There was a pause. "No, sir. I... I didn't even know she was gone." Nicholas cursed under his breath. She must have left on foot. That meant she couldn't have gone far. He grabbed his coat and stormed out of the penthouse. His mind screamed at him. What if something happens to her? What if she's out there, cold and alone? He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. The breaking point, Nicholas drove through the streets of New York, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The early morning air was biting, and the city was just beginning to stir. He checked every alley, every bench, every spot he thought she might have gone. Nothing. The frustration in his chest built until he slammed his hands against the steering wheel. "Damn it, Zariah," his voice echoed in the car. Why couldn't she see? Why couldn't she understand that she wasn't just some charity case to him? That she was everything. Nicholas ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Then suddenly a thought struck him, and his stomach dropped. There was only one place she would have gone. The park. The same place he had found her on the cold, fateful night. The moment of realization. Nicholas didn't hesitate. He turned the car around, speeding toward the park. His heart pounded as he pulled up to the curb, his eyes scanning the empty benches. And then he saw her. Curled up on the same bench where he had found her that night, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her head lowered, her body trembling from the cold. Something inside him snapped. He stepped out of the car and walked toward her, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. Zariah didn't look up. She didn't have to. She already knew. She could feel his presence. Her breath hitched, her fingers tightening around her coat. She had thought she was doing the right thing by leaving, but now as she felt him standing there, as she felt the weight of his gaze on her, she realized the truth. Leaving Nicholas had hurt more than anything, and when she finally looked up, tears shimmering in her dark eyes, she saw it, the same pain reflected in his. The hollow days without her. Nicholas Sinclair had everything, a fortune most could only dream of, power that made men respect him, and a life of luxury. But none of it mattered anymore. Not without her. The penthouse, once warm with her presence, now felt cold and empty. He would wake up expecting to hear her soft footsteps, the faint sound of her turning pages as she read by the fireplace. But there was only silence. It had been days, then weeks, and Zariah was still gone. Nicholas had searched everywhere. The park, the shelters, every street corner, every alley, anywhere she might have gone to find warmth. But she was nowhere. And with every passing day, the emptiness in his chest grew heavier. The restless night's sleep became a luxury he no longer had. At night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the image of Zariah's tearful eyes as she walked away. "Please don't look for me." She had asked him not to, but how could he not look for the one person who had changed everything for him? He hated the idea that she was out there, suffering alone. She had already been through so much, losing her family, losing her home, and now she had lost him too. Or maybe he had lost her. His life falls apart. For the first time in years, Nicholas started missing meetings. He ignored phone calls. His assistant, David, was stunned by his sudden disinterest in business. "Sir, investors are asking about you," David said cautiously one morning, setting a folder on the desk. Nicholas barely glanced at it. "I don't care." David hesitated. "Is this about that woman, Zariah?" At the sound of her name, Nicholas's jaw tightened. "Find her," he ordered, his voice dangerously low. David swallowed hard. "Sir, it's been weeks. If she doesn't want to be found—" Nicholas's cold stare cut him off. "I don't care. Keep looking." David sighed but nodded. "I'll try." Zariah's struggle. Meanwhile, Zariah was barely surviving. The streets had never been kind, but after spending time in Nicholas's world, returning to nothing was worse than before. She tried to find shelter in a rundown women's home, but the conditions were terrible. She skipped meals just to make the little money she had last. At night she lay awake, shivering, staring at the stars, wondering if Nicholas ever thought about her. But she had made her choice. She had walked away. and she had to live with that. A chance encounter. One evening, exhausted and hungry, Zariah wandered into a small cafe, hoping to warm up. She had just taken a seat in the corner when she overheard two men talking at a nearby table. Yeah, Sinclair's been losing it lately, ever since that woman disappeared. Zariah's heart stopped. Was he talking about Nicholas? The man continued. He's canceled meetings, barely sleeps. He's been looking for her for weeks. Zariah swallowed hard. Nicholas was looking for her. He still cared. A lump formed in her throat. Had she made a mistake leaving? Nicholas reaches his breaking point. Nicholas sat in his penthouse, whiskey in hand, staring at the city skyline. He had spent weeks searching for Zariah, and now for the first time, he was starting to lose hope. Maybe she really didn't want to be found. Maybe he had only been fooling himself. The thought of never seeing her again felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He closed his eyes. He had never felt this kind of pain before. Not even when Olivia left him. This was different, because Zariah was different. She wasn't just another woman. She was the only woman who had ever made him feel alive. And now without her, he felt nothing. Fate intervenes. Just as he was about to pour himself another drink, his phone buzzed. David's voice came through the speaker, breathless and urgent. "Sir, we found her." Nicholas's heart stopped. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had been waiting for these words. He shot up from his seat. "Where is she?" "She was spotted at a small cafe downtown." Nicholas didn't wait for more details. He grabbed his coat and rushed out the door. The moment of truth. Minutes later, he burst into the cafe. His sharp blue eyes scanned the crowd frantically. And then, he saw her. Zariah sat by the window, stirring a cup of coffee, looking exhausted and lost in thought. Nicholas's chest tightened. She looked thinner, tired, broken. A storm of emotions surged inside him. Relief, anger, longing. She had left him. But now he had found her, and he wasn't letting her go this time. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. Zariah must have felt his presence because she slowly looked up. Her eyes widened. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Neither spoke. Neither moved. The world around them faded. It was just them. And Nicholas knew. This was his second chance, and he was never letting her go again. A man on the edge. Nicholas Sinclair had always been in control. His life, his business, his emotions. Nothing ever slipped past his iron grip. Until now. Until Zariah. Ever since she disappeared, he had been spiraling, drowning in a storm of emotions he never thought he was capable of feeling. He couldn't focus on work. He barely ate. Sleep became a distant memory. Nothing mattered anymore. Because the one person who had made him feel alive was gone, and he was the one who drove her away. For weeks he had been searching for her, chasing shadows, hoping for a miracle. And when he finally found her in that small cafe, she hadn't run into his arms. She hadn't even smiled. She had just stared at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, as if she didn't know if she could trust him anymore. And that realization had shattered him. A confession that changes everything. Nicholas sat in his penthouse, whiskey glass in hand, staring blankly at the city lights. He had never felt this kind of pain before. Not even when Olivia left him. Not even when he built his empire from nothing, struggling through sleepless nights and ruthless competition. This was different, because Zariah was different. And now, she was slipping away. David, his assistant and closest confidant, watched him in concern. "Sir, this isn't like you," David said carefully. "You faced betrayals, failures, scandals, but you always pulled through. This time, though, you're letting it consume you." Nicholas let out a bitter laugh. "Because this time, I lost something I can't replace." David hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Then go after her. Tell her how you feel." Nicholas scoffed. "And say what? That I'm a selfish bastard who didn't realize what I had until she left?" David smirked. "That's a start." Nicholas stilled. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge it. The truth he had been avoiding all along. He loved her, Not as a distraction, not as a way to get back at Olivia, not as someone he pitied. He loved her, deeply, desperately, irrevocably. And if he didn't do something now, he was going to lose her forever. Olivia's last attempt. Just as Nicholas stood, ready to act on his decision, a familiar voice interrupted him. Nicholas. His blood ran cold. He turned around slowly. There, standing in the doorway of his penthouse, was Olivia. She looked as stunning as ever, draped in a designer dress, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, her blue eyes filled with something Nicholas hadn't seen in years. Desperation. Nicholas, we need to talk, she said softly, stepping closer. He exhaled sharply, already exhausted. There's nothing to talk about, Olivia. She flinched at his cold tone but pressed on. I was wrong, she admitted. Leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life. I see that now. Nicholas clenched his jaw. Before, those words would have meant everything to him. He had spent months after their breakup trying to understand why she had chosen another man over him. But now, they meant nothing. I don't care, he said flatly. Olivia's eyes widened. Nicholas, I said, I don't care. His voice was low and sharp. You made your choice, and I made mine. She swallowed hard, her confidence wavering. Is this about that girl? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. That homeless woman? Nicholas, you don't belong with someone like her. A slow, dangerous smile curved his lips. No, he said, stepping closer. She's the only one I've ever belonged to. Olivia's face paled. Nicholas had never looked at her like that before, like she was insignificant, like she was nothing compared to the woman he had lost. Tears welled in her eyes, but Nicholas didn't care. She was part of his past, and Zariah was his future. Without another word, he turned and walked away, straight out the door, straight toward the only woman who had ever truly mattered. A heart still searching. Nicholas had searched everywhere for Zariah. He had hired private investigators, checked every shelter, even driven through the cold streets at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. But she was gone. Every day without her felt like an unbearable weight pressing on his chest. And every night when he closed his eyes, all he could see was her warm brown skin, her soft, sorrowful eyes, her quiet laughter that had once filled his penthouse, and then her absence. It was driving him mad. How had he let her slip away? How had he been so blind? Then one evening, as he drove past a busy intersection in Manhattan, something stopped him cold. A small figure, bundled in a thin coat, standing at the corner of the street. She was holding a bouquet of roses, carefully wrapping them in paper. The sight of her stole his breath away. It was Zariah. After weeks of agony, of searching, of longing, fate had brought her back to him. A desperate reunion. Nicholas's heart slammed against his ribcage. For a moment he could only stare, afraid that if he moved, if he blinked, she would disappear like a cruel mirage. But she was real. She was right there, and he wasn't going to let her slip away again. Without thinking, he threw open his car door and sprinted across the street. Zariah! She froze. The bouquet of flowers nearly slipped from her fingers. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned. Their eyes met, and Nicholas felt everything. Weeks of longing, weeks of pain, weeks of aching love bottled up inside him. He saw shock flicker across her delicate features, then fear, then something deeper. But before he could say a word, she spun on her heel and started walking away. She tries to run. Nicholas's heart lurched. Not this time. Zariah, wait! He called, pushing through the crowded sidewalk. She walked faster, clutching the bouquet against her chest. She had disappeared once. She wasn't going to do it again. With long strides, Nicholas closed the distance and caught her wrist, gently but firmly. She gasped. Let me go, she whispered. Her voice was small, wounded, afraid. Nicholas loosened his grip but didn't let go. Zariah, please, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Just listen to me. She kept her head down. Why? So you can play the hero again? So you can feel better about yourself by rescuing the poor homeless girl? His chest tightened. No, he said firmly. Because I love you. A love he can't hide. Zariah flinched. She lifted her gaze, staring at him as if she hadn't heard him right. What? Nicholas took a shaky breath, stepping closer. I love you, Zariah. The words poured out of him, raw and unfiltered. I love your strength. I love the way you see beauty in the smallest things. I love how you make me feel, like I'm more than just my money or my name. Tears welled in her eyes. You don't mean that, she whispered. He cupped her face, his touch unbearably gentle. I do, he swore. I've never meant anything more in my life. Zariah's lips trembled. Her walls were crumbling, but there was still fear in her eyes. Nicholas, I don't belong in your world. He let out a soft, broken laugh. Then I'll leave my world behind, he whispered. She gasped. I don't care about my wealth, my reputation, my status. None of it means a damn thing without you. Her breath hitched. Nicholas. A moment of truth. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Nicholas wiped it away with his thumb, his touch lingering. Then he kissed her. Software. Slow. Desperate. Like a man who had been starving for weeks and had finally found salvation. Zariah melted into him, her fingers gripping his coat as if she was afraid he'd disappear. The kiss was everything. It was love. It was longing. It was home. When they finally pulled apart, Nicholas rested his forehead against hers. Come home, he whispered. Zariah bit her lip, searching his eyes. Are you sure? Nicholas smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I've never been more sure of anything. She took a shaky breath. Then slowly, she nodded. And in that moment, Nicholas knew. He wasn't letting her go. Not now. Not ever. A plea from the heart. Nicholas's grip on Zariah's hands tightened, his eyes filled with desperation. Come home with me, he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. Zariah's heart ached at the raw emotion in his words, but she shook her head, not because she didn't want to, but because she was afraid, afraid that this was all a dream, afraid that reality would crush her again. Nicholas, she began, but he stopped her with a gentle touch. I don't want you to come back as a guest, he said. I want you to come back as the woman I love. Tears glistened in Zariah's eyes. Her lips trembled. I love you too, she whispered. Nicholas exhaled sharply as if those words had freed him from chains he didn't even know were binding him. But then, she pulled away. But love isn't enough, she said, her voice breaking. You and I, we're too different. Nicholas frowned. What do you mean? Zariah hugged herself, as if shielding herself from her own emotions. You're a millionaire, Nicholas, she said. You live in a world of power, influence, and privilege. And She looked down at her worn-out coat, her hands rough from weeks of struggle. I'm a girl who was sleeping on a park bench when you found me. Nicholas took a step closer, his hands cupping her face. Zariah, he whispered, I don't give a damn about any of that. She let out a broken laugh. But the world does. His unshakable promise. Nicholas shook his head. Let them talk, he said. Let them judge. I don't care. Zariah searched his eyes, looking for hesitation, for doubt, but there was none. You deserve someone from your world, she whispered. Nicholas let out a frustrated sigh. My world, he repeated. Do you think my wealth makes me happy? That any of this, the money, the penthouse, the status, means a damn thing without you? Zariah's breath hitched. I was miserable before you, Zariah, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I was living in a cage of luxury, but I was alone. A tear slipped down Zariah's cheek. Nicholas wiped it away, his thumb lingering against her soft skin. I don't want someone from my world, he whispered. I want you. She bit her lip, struggling against the overwhelming tide of emotions crashing down on her. Nicholas. I love you, he said again, firmly this time. Zariah closed her eyes as if trying to fight back the truth she had buried deep inside. And then, she finally let go. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she collapsed into his arms. Nicholas held her tightly, as if he would never let her slip away again. A decision that changes everything. The cold night air wrapped around them, but Nicholas's embrace was warm, safe, home. Zariah could hear the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath his expensive coat, a heart that now belonged to her. She clung to him, burying her face in his chest. Nicholas pressed his lips to her hair, whispering words only she could hear. "I'll fight for you," he promised, "every single day." Zariah lifted her head, her deep brown eyes meeting his. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. "I'll come home with you." Nicholas let out a soft laugh, filled with relief. "Not because I need a place to stay," she clarified. He gently cupped her chin, tilting her face toward his. "I know," he whispered. "Not because I feel obligated," she continued, her voice shaking. Nicholas smiled, pressing his forehead to hers. "I know." She took a deep breath. "I'll come home with you because I love you." And in that moment, nothing else mattered. An unforgettable proposal. The city skyline shimmered under the moonlight, casting a soft glow over Nicholas's penthouse balcony. A cool breeze drifted through the air, carrying the scent of fresh roses, a scent that now reminded Zariah of him. She stood there, wrapped in a warm coat, her fingers gripping the railing as she gazed at the view. She had come so far, from the cold, unforgiving streets to this moment, standing beside the man she loved. But she had no idea that tonight would change her life forever. Nicholas appeared behind her, his hands slipping around her waist as he pulled her close. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured, resting his chin on her shoulder. Zariah smiled, leaning into his warmth. "Yes, but I don't think I'll ever find anything more beautiful than this moment." Nicholas's heart pounded. This was it. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the velvet box. Taking a deep breath, he slowly turned her around. "Zariah," he said softly, his deep blue eyes locking onto hers. She frowned slightly. "What is it?" Nicholas took her hands in his grip firm yet gentle. "I've spent my whole life chasing wealth, building a future, searching for something to fill the emptiness inside me," he confessed. "But none of it mattered until you walked into my life." Zariah's eyes widened as realization dawned on her. Her breath hitched as Nicholas slowly lowered himself to one knee. The world around them stood still. Zariah's hands flew to her mouth as she gasped. "Nicholas!" He pulled out the velvet box, opening it to reveal a stunning diamond ring that sparkled under the moonlight. "I don't care about the past, about where we started," Nicholas continued, his voice raw with emotion. "All I care about is where we're going. Together." Tears welled in Zariah's eyes. "You are my heart, my home, my future." Nicholas took a deep breath, his hands slightly trembling. "Zariah, will you marry me?" Love has no boundaries. For a moment, Zariah couldn't speak. Her heart pounded so hard she was afraid it would burst. She had never imagined a moment like this. A few months ago, she had nothing. No family, no home, no hope. And now this man, this kind, loving, wonderful man, was kneeling before her, asking her to be his forever. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded frantically. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. Nicholas let out a shaky laugh of relief. "Yes?" Zariah laughed through her tears. "Yes, 1,000,000 times, yes!" Nicholas slipped the ring onto her finger, and before she could say another word, he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground. Zariah squealed, wrapping her arms around his neck as he spun her around. Their laughter echoed into the night, pure, unfiltered joy. Nicholas lowered her back down, but before she could catch her breath, he cupped her face and kissed her. It was a kiss filled with passion, promises, and forever. As they pulled apart, Nicholas rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Zariah," he whispered. She smiled through her tears. "I love you too, Nicholas." And in that moment, she knew. She had found her home. From a charity case to a queen, months passed in a beautiful blur. Zariah no longer slept on cold benches. She now woke up wrapped in the arms of the man who adored her. She was no longer looked down upon. She was admired. The same society that once whispered about her now watched in awe. The media went wild when news broke of Nicholas Sinclair's engagement to a woman they once dismissed as a nobody. But Zariah was not a nobody. She was his everything. And then came the wedding. The grand, breathtaking event that no one could have predicted. The same ballroom where Olivia once tried to humiliate her was now the place where she became Mrs. Sinclair. Zariah stood at the end of the aisle, radiant in a white gown, her brown skin glowing under the golden chandeliers. As she walked forward, her eyes locked onto Nicholas's. His expression was one of pure devotion. When she reached him, he took her hands, his touch gentle yet sure. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me," Nicholas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Zariah blinked back tears. "And you are my miracle." As they exchanged vows, the room erupted in applause, cheers, and happy tears. Zariah glanced around and saw familiar faces, people who once doubted her. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had everything she ever wanted. She had him. And as Nicholas kissed her, the world disappeared. It was just them, two souls that had found their way to each other, against all odds. A fairy tale ending that no one expected. Zariah had once been nothing but a lost girl on the streets. Now she was the wife of the man who saw her worth before she even saw it herself. She wasn't just attending a wedding. She was creating her own fairy tale. And as she and Nicholas danced under the twinkling lights, she knew this was only the beginning. Because love had no boundaries.